Good evening and welcome to today's event. I'm Linda Bathgate, the Assistant Director and Editor-in-Chief at Washington State University Press. As we get started, I would like to acknowledge that the Washington State University Pullman campus is located on the homelands of the Nimiipuu tribe, also known as the Nez Perce and the Palis people. We acknowledge their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. WSU Press is committed to publishing works that foster a deeper understanding of the Pacific Northwest and the contributions of its native peoples. Tonight's event is entitled New Perspectives on Captain Cook and the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and it will feature a conversation and Q&A session with David Nicandri, highlighting his two new books on explorers in the Pacific Northwest. The first book is Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes, published by University of British Columbia Press in November 2020. Second book is Lewis and Clark Reframed, Examining Ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie, published by Washington State University Press in December of 2020. This event is being recorded and it will be available to view via the WSU Press YouTube channel. We also have a link for closed captioning, which is posted in the YouTube chat. If you have questions you would like Dave to answer at the end of the session, please put those questions into the YouTube chat bar. I will pose them to Dave after he finishes his conversation. This presentation is a collaboration between the presses at the University of British Columbia and Washington State University. We are extremely grateful for the help from And Books 2, an independent bookstore in Clarkston, Washington, the Cowlitz County Historical Museum in Kelso, Washington, and the International Captain Cook Society. If you're here watching, it's likely due to the outstanding promotional efforts of these co-sponsors. If you would like to order the books that we talk about tonight, please use the links to the press websites that we are posting in the YouTube chat bar. That information will also be included at the end of the session. And where possible and safe to do so, we encourage you to visit your local bookstore. Now, I'd like to introduce the guest for the evening, Dave Nicandri. Dave has spent most of his life working to preserve and promote the history of the Pacific Northwest. After receiving his master's degree in history from the University of Idaho, he began work as a historian at the Washington State Capitol Museum in 1972. In 1987, he became director of the Washington State Historical Society. He served in that role for 24 years until his retirement in 2011. During that tenure, he was also executive editor of Columbia, the magazine of Northwest history published by the Society. Among his previously published books are River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, published in 2009, and the edited volume Arctic Ambitions, Captain Cook and the Northwest Passage, which he co-edited with James Barnett in 2015. He was awarded the Charles Gates Memorial Award in 2004, and he received the Robert Gray Medal from the Washington State Historical Society in 2011. He holds honorary doctorates from Gonzaga University, the University of Puget Sound, and the University of Idaho. He currently serves on the Board of Trustees for the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. I would like to thank Dave for joining us tonight and for sharing his stories and his knowledge with us. I now hand the microphone over to Jim Elliott from the Cowlitz County Historical Museum.
Thank you, Linda. Should I turn my camera on, you think, here? There we go. I'm Jim Elliott, office manager at the Cowlitz County Historical Museum. in Kelso on behalf of Museum Director Joseph Govednik. It's a pleasure to partner with UBC Press and WSU Press in promoting this program. Dave Nicandri has presented on numerous occasions with the Cowles County Historical Museum during the tenure of our previous director, David Freese. Many of you know him. So it's a pleasure to participate in another of David Nicandri's programs. Lewis and Clark are, of course, relevant to our regional history here in the Lower Columbia region, of which Cowles County is a part. We know many of our members will be very interested in this topic and these books. The Cowles County Historical Museum is open during phase 1 of Healthy Washington by appointment, Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 4. And thank you for your interest in this program. And I would like to turn the floor over to James McNevin, Senior Editor of UBC Press. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jim, and thank you everyone for attending. It's hard to know who's out there in YouTube land, but I'm assuming there are people out there watching us. Dave, I guess we'll get the event underway. I guess I'll be facilitating this evening, but my thinking is people are here to hear you talk, Dave. So that's the format. I guess will be that I'll be asking some questions, and we'll do the talk from there. And I think we've got all our technical difficulties sorted out here. Everything's good on your end, Dave?
Yes, hopefully.
Okay, all right. Well, since, like I said, we don't know exactly who's out there in YouTube land, and we are launching 2 different books on 2 different topics, and I think it's probably safe to assume that we have a mix of Captain Cook aficionados and Lewis and Clark aficionados, and possibly just some people who are generally curious. I thought, a good place to start would be if you wouldn't mind giving us maybe a little, intro, Cook 101 and Lewis and Clark 101, just so that everybody is sort of on the same page. Tell us a bit about what these books are about, who these people are. Be a good place.
Very good, James. Thank you, and thanks, Linda, and the folks at the Cowles County Historical Museum. I appreciate your interest and support. So quick 101, logically, we should start with Captain Cook. Chronologically, he comes first. Cook was a Yorkshireman from Northern England, grew up in an agrarian context, started his nautical career in the coal trade, running, literally taking the coals from Newcastle to London and the empty ships back, joined the Royal Navy in 1754, just about the time or nigh upon the start of the 7 Years' War in North America, more commonly known as the French and Indian War. He had noteworthy service in the Quebec campaign, especially given his rank as a sailing master. He plotted a navigational course for the British fleet that enabled them to get past the French citadel at Quebec. And of course, leading ultimately to the British victory over France, 1759. And subsequent to that campaign, he was posted to Newfoundland, where he conducted a multi-year survey of that island's very complex geography, which brought him to the attention of folks at the Admiralty, so that in 1769, as an up-and-comer, in the Royal Navy, he was promoted to lieutenant and given the assignment of sailing a ship for the British and the Royal Society, a learned society in Great Britain, to initially an undesignated spot, but later discerned to be Tahiti in the South Pacific, where he and other astronomers were to conduct an observation of the transit of Venus, which was a celebrated astronomical multinational experiment. Very complicated geometry and mathematical calculations by tracking the timing of Venus's transit over the face of the sun. And as viewed from disparate parts on the Earth's surface, one could most famously calculate the distance of the sun to the Earth and other related correlations. Subsequent to that, Cook circumnavigated New Zealand delineated its insular character. It was thought perhaps as a site, as a northern extremity for a mythical southern continent. Later sailed and surveyed the east coast of Australia, transited the transit of the Torres Strait, separating New Guinea from Australia. After a stop in Batavia, made it home to a great celebration, not necessarily for Cook himself, but for the naturalists, Joseph Banks principally, who sailed with him. The voyage was considered such a success that immediately upon his return, or virtually upon his return, Cook was commissioned for a second voyage to the South Pacific, this time with the explicit and sole mission of determining if there was in fact a continent in the mid to high latitudes of the Southern Hemisphere that mirrored the Eurasian landmass in the Northern Hemisphere. The thinking was that because since the Earth seemed to spin smoothly on its axis, there had to be a corresponding mass of land in the Southern Hemisphere to match that what was known in the Northern Hemisphere, or otherwise the world would spin in an unbalanced fashion, which it didn't. But this was a very naive concept. During the course of his 3 years in the high latitudes of both the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Ocean, Cook determined that there was not the classically conceived southern continent, but he did gain an intimation by virtue of his circumnavigation of what we know as Antarctica, that there had to be a southern polar continent, and he was the first one to establish that. He returns to Great Britain and is immediately sent back on his third and what would be his final voyage, this one looking for the Northwest Passage, which combined with the mythical southern continent was one of the great geographical puzzles of the age. Cook was not able to find a Northwest Passage on his voyage. He was off the northwest coast of our Pacific slope here in the spring and summer of 1778. He did not find a Northwest Passage then because it didn't exist then. He met ice off of Icy Cape on the northwest coast of Alaska, returned to winter over in Hawaii, laying the groundwork for a subsequent return. But of course, as most people who have any inkling of Cook's career know, Cook was killed in Hawaii, but he inculcated the spirit of discovery to such an extent that even after his death, Charles Clark and the other officers returned the two ships, Discovery and Resolution, to the north for another unsuccessful attempt at finding the Northwest Passage and returned to Great Britain. And Cook entered into the proverbial halls of history at that time. Now, Lewis and Clark follow quite naturally in the wake of Captain Cook. It's commonly referred to in the study of Lewis and Clark that Lewis and Clark were looking for the Northwest Passage, and that is true, but they were looking for a different version of the Northwest Passage. Cook had determined there was no classic Pacific Ocean to Atlantic Ocean Northwest Passage. The ice just simply blocked his way. George Vancouver, who's one of the major figures in Lewis and Clark Reframed, the book WSU Press put out, determined that there was no mid-latitude Northwest Passage. He discovered, and one of his lieutenants named Puget Sound, but the inland waters out here, the Salish Sea, as it's commonly referred to, do not approximate Hudson Bay, let alone the Atlantic Basin more properly. And so that second version of the Northwest Passage also came to naught. A new generation of explorer, most prominently Alexander Mackenzie, a fur trader working for the Northwest Company, a competitor of the Hudson Bay Company at that point, operating out of Montreal. He popularized, by virtue of his two overland expeditions to the Arctic in 1789 and to the Pacific in 1793, that even if there wasn't the direct saltwater route that Cook looked for, or the shortcut that a Western analog to Hudson Bay that Vancouver looked for. In the absence of those, the Northwest Passage was such a fixed idea in the imagination of Western commerce, Western geographers, that Mackenzie popularized the idea that an equivalent Northwest Passage can be stitched together through lakes and rivers that traverse and transit the height and breadth of North America. When Mackenzie published his Voyages from Montreal in 1801, that was the literal seed moment for the Lewis and Clark expedition, because among the avid readers of Mackenzie's Voyages from Montreal was Thomas Jefferson, who quickly and strategically discerned the upshot of what Mackenzie had written. In his final few paragraphs, Mackenzie said that if British trading interests, by building this network of rivers and lakes crossing the continent, could dominate the fur trade, Jefferson saw that as a strategic threat. And so for that reason, determined on getting his own team out in the field to create a more southern version of this network, thinking that the Missouri River and the Columbia River would match, maybe even be superior to the network that Mackenzie outlined in Voyages from Montreal. And that, somewhat breathlessly, is the history of the Northwest Passage up to the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804, 1806.
Okay, thank you, Dave. That was great. That was very helpful. I guess my next question would be, these are both fairly well-known figures, well-known expeditions, and I'm struck that both books. So one is Captain Cook Rediscovered, the other is Lewis and Clark Reframed. So in both cases, we have this rediscovered, reframed thing going on. So I guess it's sort of a two-part question. On the one hand, I guess, what in what ways is what is distinctive about your two books that you've brought out now? And I guess in what ways are you trying to rediscover or reframe these people who have been written about by many other historians before? And what is distinctive about these two books, and why rediscover and reframe these two subjects at this point in time?
Very good. Yeah. Well, I think another way of putting that, James, is what's the essential aspect of these two books? Yeah. And I'd say, again, taking them in chronological order, with Captain Cook, historians have kind of made him captive to two paradigms of perception and interpretation, and not illogically. Coming from Great Britain, scholars hailing from the United Kingdom he's been a favored subject, and scholars hailing from that quadrant emphasize that the natural history, Joseph Banks connection, he being a famous aristocrat, later president of the Royal Society, and correspondingly, kind of the antipodes of Greenwich, literally, is the vicinity around New Zealand and Australia. And historians and cultural institutions in the Southwest Pacific have kind of, in a way, somewhat illegitimately, at least not recently, but classically over the course of the 20th century, certainly the 19th as well, kind of viewed Captain Cook as a foundational figure, the American equivalent of a founding father, although he was neither in the case of either New Zealand or Australia. So you have these two schools of perspective: Great Britain, the antipodes down here with New Zealand and Australia. So that's one paradigm. The second is, from the very time the first account of Cook's first voyage was published, and certainly amplified by the accounts of the second and third, because if only for staging purposes, Cook spent a lot of time in Polynesia. Polynesian exoticism just kind of took a hold of the Western imagination. I refer to this as the palm tree paradigm. The sandy beaches, from a European perspective, what was viewed as kind of exotic cultural patterns, certainly when it came to sexuality and related topics. So I've tried to divest myself from those two paradigms and look principally at Cook's third voyage from a North American vantage point, which has been rarely done from a career-wide perspective, has never been done in Cook's case. There have been some other regional treatments of aspects of Cook's third voyage along the Pacific slope of North America, of course, but a career-wide perspective from a North American vantage has not been attempted before this book. So that's kind of the essence of Captain Cook Rediscovered, looking at him from a North American vantage, and more particularly as a polar explorer. We can get into that topic in greater detail. As for Lewis and Clark Reframed, the inspiration for that book is actually a volume published in the run-up to the Lewis and Clark bicentennial early in the last decade by W. Raymond Wood, called Prologue to Lewis and Clark. What Ray did in that book is study or analyze the fact that contrary to a common misperception, and a lot of people who like or study, like to read about the Lewis and Clark expedition, the American captains were not the first explorers to be on the stretch of river from St. Louis, Missouri to present-day Bismarck, North Dakota, more specifically to the homelands of the Mandan and Hidatsa Indians who hosted the Lewis and Clark expedition over the course of 1804 or 5. One of the consequences of that I talk about in my book, drawing on the hint from Ray Wood, is that Meriwether Lewis is mute, literally, on the trip up the Missouri River from St. Louis. Clark is keeping a daily journal, he's doing the captain's log, but Lewis very rarely, a couple of days here and there, makes a journal entry. And that's in reflection of what Ray Wood had demonstrated with the prologue to Lewis and Clark, namely, that wasn't really a discovery zone for Meriwether Lewis. That the terra incognita, to the extent that term applies, if at all, in the Lewis and Clark idiom, doesn't really commence until one goes westward from the Mandan and Hidatsa villages into the upper Missouri, up to the Great Falls, to the Three Forks, to the Continental Divide, and then into Columbia River country. So that's what Wood did on the Missouri. There's a corresponding silence to Meriwether Lewis once he gets on the Columbia River. He keeps a very evocative and polished, it's a literary classic from North Dakota to the Rocky Mountains. But once he gets on the main stem of the Columbia River, Meriwether Lewis's voice disappears entirely. My thesis in Lewis and Clark Reframed, again, the mirror interpretation for what Ray Wood did on the Missouri, is that to Lewis, in effect, the Columbia River stretch of the voyage, notwithstanding that was the ultimate mission to get to the Pacific Ocean, it was strangely anticlimactic. And through several chapters in the book, I argued one of the reasons why is that Lewis, I won't say was intimidated, but he was certainly conscious of the fact that Cook and Vancouver and Mackenzie had all been to this zone of geography, and that there wasn't, there were certainly important events, but there was no great geographic breakthrough to be made. And so for that reason, Lewis's voice disappears. At least that's one of the theories I try to bring out in Lewis and Clark Reframed.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I want to pick up on one of the things that you said there about Captain Cook as a polar explorer, because when you first approached me with this manuscript, however long ago that was, the Captain Cook manuscript, that was the thing that was to me most intriguing about it as someone who doesn't know much about Captain Cook, and I guess I was operating within the palm tree paradigm, and I had never thought of Captain Cook as a polar explorer. So wondering if you want to elaborate a bit on that a bit, especially since the polar ice caps are obviously much in the news these days, and in the context of climate change and so on. So I guess a bit about Captain Cook's legacy as a polar explorer and its relevance for today. I think that's a really fascinating aspect of the Captain Cook book that I found fascinating anyway.
Thanks, James. Yes, that's in fact what what drew me to the Cook story. I mean, I knew the rough outline, being a regional historian, knew that he didn't find a Northwest Passage, had been killed in Hawaii, etc. But it was the pace of global warming this decade and last gave me the idea of kind of looking at Cook through a new lens. And I was surprised once I actually got into it and I write about this topic at great length, that although we associate Cook with sandy beaches and palm trees, of course, his death in Hawaii does nothing but accentuate those associated notions. But in fact, Cook sailed more miles at sea in the high latitudes of the northern and southern hemisphere, which I'll define as anything 45 degrees and above, to the South Pole or towards the North Pole. Far more miles in the high latitudes than in the tropical zone, where historians have consigned him by choice. Anthropologists, who are actually a good share of the people who have told the Cook story, consigned Cook to the tropical zone out of necessity, because that's where he has his famous and not infrequently infamous encounters with indigenous people in Polynesia and Micronesia. So not only did Cook sail a lot in the high latitudes towards the poles, but I think what even surprised me once I got into it, and I like to think being one of the major contributions of Captain Cook rediscovered, is that Cook is actually a polar explorer of the first rank. He was the first man to cross both the Antarctic Circle and the Arctic Circle in that order. But he was also a pioneering ice scientist, which is I can go into as much or as little detail as you want. But but to understand Cook's breakthrough as an ice scientist, I need to address, much like the mythology of the missing southern continent, it was presumed up until Cook's time that at great distance from land, salt water did not freeze. That is to say, when sailors from Europe encountered an iceberg or they encountered low ice, whether it was slushy or packed or what's called field ice, that was an emanation from some terrestrial source, because it was presumed salt water at great distance from land would not freeze. You might ask, why would people think that? Because if you melt the water of an iceberg floating in the great Southern Ocean, or if you even melt pack ice, that the low ice that encircles Antarctica, you melt that also yields fresh water. So in the naive understanding prior to Cook, it was thought that therefore that these icy substances had to emerge from some landform. Cook crisscrossed the southern continent, vacating one band of latitude after another over the course of 3 years: the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, vacating it of any great extent of land. There's an island here, South Georgia, a stray archipelago there, the South Sandwich Islands, both in the South Atlantic. But there was no volume of land from which all of this ice, whether in iceberg form or the low ice, there was no land from it to emerge. So he concluded that it was from a polar continent that all of this ice emerged. And of course, fundamentally, he was correct. Cook was perhaps, and I think I'm safe in saying this, the first person to see an iceberg calve off a glacier in the southern hemisphere, saw it float out of the bay there off of the island of South Georgia, which Ernest Shackleton made famous early in the 20th century, and deduced that that is where all the ice comes from. And so Cook, again, crossed the two circles, polar circles, laid the foundation for sea ice science, iceberg calving, and many other great findings during the course of his voyages, but as a pioneering glaciologist, those are the foundations of Cook's career. And it's an entirely new vantage point and frame of reference for him than, again, the Polynesian, or I'm sorry, the palm tree paradigm that consigns him to the world of palm trees and sandy beaches.
Thank you. Yeah, which I mean, I guess that in a way leads actually to the question that I was thinking of asking next, which is, we talked about this Captain Cook rediscovered and Lewis and Clark reframed, and I guess another word that comes up. I'm looking at the back cover of the Captain Cook book right now. There's a blurb from Ian McLaren at the University of Alberta, who describes the book as a fresh revisionist study. So I want to ask what you make of that term, revisionist or revisionism, and what role you see yourself playing in writing revisionist accounts about these figures.
Yes. Well, the term itself has an interesting history.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in grad school, revisionist history, the old progressive historians, the new left historians, it was held in great regard. Unfortunately, the Holocaust deniers gave revisionist history a bad name, and so one must be careful when one uses the term. But the fundamental aspect of revisionism relative to Cook, and aside from being a signal polar explorer as well as the tropical explorer, everyone knows about him, is that as applied to his third voyage, because he's killed on that third voyage, historians have tended to kind of write off the entire enterprise. To them, it didn't seem to measure up to the standard Cook had set with his vigor and various discoveries on the first and second voyage. I refer to it as the tired voyager trope, when in fact, I argue, and this gets to the revisionistic point, that Cook's third voyage was actually the most accomplished of them, notwithstanding the fact that he was killed on it. The fact that he was killed in Hawaii flavored historiographic judgment as to how well he had done during the entire run of the expedition. But that's another aspect of historiography that I think I've revised here, because historians, among other things that they say, Cook wasn't his usual self on the third voyage. They attribute the circumstances that led to his death when he was killed by the Hawaiian natives at Kealakekua Bay in February of 1779. But as I document in Captain Cook Reframed, there were at least half a dozen times during the first two voyages and earlier in the third where Cook was in scenarios much like the ultimately terminal one, where he could just as easily have been killed. But he bent out of the way from an arrow going over his shoulder, or the rock just missed his head. So Cook could have been killed at any point in this during his three voyages. He happened to get killed on the third voyage, which I think has unjustly framed how historians have interpreted that final voyage of his. My preferred way of explaining this is that when word finally got to London in January of 1780, coming from Kamchatka of all places, that Cook had been killed the previous winter in Hawaii. When word of that finally got to Great Britain, of course, there was a torrent of commentary in the daily press. And one of the early commentators said something that I think just speaks to this major point I've been making here at the end of this riff, which is, it's not surprising Cook should have been killed. What is truly surprising is that he lived as long as he did, because he repeatedly put himself at risk, and there was so much danger attendant upon his voyages around Antarctica and towards the North Pole. So that's what I would say is the revisionistic element of the Cook book. As for Lewis and Clark reframed the thesis. There's actually an extension of my earlier book, A River of Promise, which came out upwards of a decade ago, where the Lewis and Clark story is a lot more complicated than has generally been credited. And one aspect of which has been in desperate need of recalibration is the relationship between Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Now, they certainly had a great working relationship, although one of the arguments I make in a chapter in Lewis and Clark Reframed is that William Clark was not Meriwether Lewis's best lifelong friend. There was a fellow in Philadelphia by the name of Mahlon Dickerson, who Lewis palled around with both before and after the expedition to the West. And his relationship with Dickerson's very revealing into the Lewis persona, including his failed love life, and maybe even shed some light on the circumstances leading up to Lewis's suicide. Dickerson's himself an interesting figure because in the Lewis and Clark world, Dickerson's this guy who comes and goes in Philadelphia when Lewis passes through town episodically. But for people who are students of the Charles Wilkes expedition, an American global circumnavigation that started in the late 1830s, that also came to the Pacific Northwest, people who study the Wilkes expedition maybe have a passing awareness of the fact that Mahlon Dickerson, Lewis's friend from 30 years earlier, was at that point of time and successively Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren's Secretary of the Navy. And here's the point of that. Dickerson did everything he could to stymie the launch of what we know as the Wilkes expedition. And I argue in Lewis and Clark Reframed that the bad association he has with exploration history, with the tragic fate of his best friend, Meriwether Lewis, and that perception was reciprocal, that I argue had a strange influence on Mahlon Dickerson's enthusiasm for exploration, which is why the Wilkes expedition, voyage was so problematic and took so long to get underway. So those are some of the revisionistic elements of both books. People have said I have kind of an iconoclastic attitude towards history. I like going against the grain, for better or for worse. I just find that more interesting. And I will just say this in summary regarding the two principal figures in both books. Historians, in my estimation, have been overly critical of James Cook, and they've given Meriwether Lewis far more benefit of the doubt than was warranted. In Cook's case, they don't pay enough attention to what his missions actually were. Historians of Cook, certainly of his third voyage, want Cook to run the expedition they want him to run, not the one the Admiralty directed. In Lewis's case, he's just a very complicated figure. He had a good working relationship with William Clark, but it was more complicated than that. It was not at all times the best friendship of all time, as Stephen Ambrose once famously characterized it.
Okay, well, building on that, on what you're saying about being iconoclastic, or you like going against the grain. I guess what would you see as sort of the most controversial, potentially controversial claims that you make advancing in either of these books, or if do you see anything controversial about either of these books? I guess would be the first place to start.
Yeah, I think again, I'll take them in their chronological order. I think with the cookbook, if I can call it that, I think some people might find it controversial that I lay out the groundwork that Cook was as vigorous and as accomplished on his third voyage as he was at any time on the first two voyages, which are generally credited as being Cook at his best. Again, that judgment has been flavored by the fact that Cook, I would argue, was coincidentally killed on the third voyage. There wasn't some fatal aspect of Cook's deportment on the third voyage that led to his demise in Hawaii in 1779. And I'd say the other thing is in common with both books, somewhat controversial, because I try to with proper judgment and discretion, I try to argue that Enlightenment era explorers, whether James Cook or Meriwether Lewis principally, they've gotten somewhat of a bad rap. They've become captive to the figure in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And that's not what Enlightenment exploration was about. It's certainly not what exploration from the previous era, the era of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, and the more overtly imperial and evangelical phase of European exploration was about. Nor was it as nefarious as the maritime-based exploration. Those were very problematic figures who followed in the wake of both Lewis and Clark terrestrially or Captain Cook in a maritime sense. In fact, I use a line in the Cook book that I've actually borrowed from another historian that applies both to Cook and Lewis. They have become, unfortunately, emblematic invaders. By and large, and there were exceptions, there were extremely negative outcomes and violence and deaths to Native people associated with all of those ventures. But by and large, they were entirely benign compared to the transgressions and violence and theft and untold horrors that the generations of people who succeeded the initial explorers perpetrated on the Native people. So that, just to kind of make my point explicit, Cook or Lewis and Clark, because they are first, inherit all of the sins of the damage to indigenous cultures wherever they went, when in fact the actual perpetration, the great volume of crimes perpetrated against Native people were done by those who came in the wake of these explorers, whom I might add, and this is why it was important for the press to start out the way they did, those of us who live in these lands today, lands in many cases expropriated from Native people or acquired by treaty under duress. So it's easy to blame Meriwether Lewis or James Cook regarding them bringing a foreign civilization to indigenous peoples. But the question we need to ask is, what are we doing to redress those very same circumstances? So if there's anything controversial in either book, is I try to put these explorers in context. It's not all black and white. In many respects, they've gotten a bum rap, certainly Enlightenment era exploration, because it's been extrapolated and extended both forward in time and backward in time, has not gotten the fair treatment that it has deserved from historians.
Okay, well, I think we're probably soon going to hand things over to the Q&A, but I just wanted to ask one more question that I guess actually does follow quite logically from that, which I guess is a broader question about the study of Enlightenment exploration, or just exploration more generally, the history of exploration. I guess my question is in a very broad sense. Why study the history of exploration? What questions remain to be asked? What are some directions for future research in this area, both for yourself and just what do you see as the unexplored areas of the history of exploration?
Yeah, well, exploration history has a certain appeal as a subgenre, seems to me, for several reasons. First of all, exploration stories, because of the scale of the endeavors, are digestible human interrelationships. You're talking about, in the case of Lewis and Clark, 35 people and the natives they met along the way. Or in the case of Captain Cook, the several dozen people on his ships, that dynamic. In other words, rather than dealing with issues of statecraft and military campaigns and other deep and complicated developments that might entail and influence the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, these are relatively compact stories. And so one can discern in them dynamics of the human condition that is accessible, and that makes it appealing. Someone once said, all stories are, moving to the second interpretation of why exploration is an appealing subject. Every story is about someone going on a trip or a stranger coming to town. There's just something inherently interesting about that dynamic. And then there's kind of the topographic or terrestrial aspect of this, because there's something about the linearity of riverbanks in the case of Lewis and Clark, or the oceanic horizon in the case of Captain Cook, or the edge of the ice again in the case of Cook. These linear zones, there's kind of a psychological appeal to what's at the end of that, what's around the bend in the river, what's over that horizon. And so I think that's part of what's going on. That's why exploration history has appeal. And there, as I said earlier, there's kind of the compact study of human interaction. As to where exploration history goes from here, one thing I've kind of learned with my own study, and I've kind of become an evangelist of sorts along these lines. I think we're long past the point where we can study any explorer in isolation. In part because the travel literature is in fact a literary form. It has its own conventions. And when we just study Captain Cook or we just study Meriwether Lewis, these figures take on kind of a caricatured form. When you study not only them against each other, but other explorers, a George Vancouver or an Alexander Mackenzie, you develop a sense that what might strike someone as being exceptional, for example, Sacagawea meeting her brother-in-law, having been brought from North Dakota to the border of Idaho and Montana, and her running into her brother. In the lore of Lewis and Clark, that's an exceptional story. Stephen Ambrose went on and on about no scriptwriter would dare write such a scene. But if you read the account of Alexander Mackenzie or Samuel Hearne, another Canadian explorer, these kinds of episodes happened with kind of a routine regularity. So to give some balance to these stories, to make them less exceptional without making them uninteresting, and to give a full dimension of these people as human beings, exploration history needs to be studied kind of in parallel, and not just within what its own vertical column. And so I think going forward, comparative history is definitely the way to go with the future of exploration historiography.
Okay, thank you. I think I mean that was a fascinating talk, and so thank you, Dave, and congratulations, obviously, on the publication of these two books simultaneously. It's amazing. I think now I'm going to pass the mic back to Linda Bathgate from Washington State, who has been watching the YouTube chat and I think has some additional questions that have come through there from the Q&A. But I guess before I do that, I just want to thank you again, Dave, and I also want to thank Linda and everyone else at Washington State for co-hosting this event and for doing so much work to get all the technical sides sorted out. I think it went pretty smoothly in the end. I wasn't sure it would, but I think it worked out pretty well.
Thank you, James.
All right, thank you, and Linda, over to you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Dave. It's amazing what the scope of what you learned in your work and study, and just all of the depth of your knowledge of these sort of pivotal explorers. So I have a couple of questions. We're still waiting to see what our viewers might ask in the chat, but I wanted to know how, like, if someone is just starting off, is very interested in the history of Northwest explorers, but doesn't really know kind of where to start. Do you have any books you would recommend that they read to kind of give them a big picture of Pacific Northwest explorers?
Yes, I think certainly for Captain Cook and Lewis and Clark, I have a few authors and some books whose title I hope I can quickly remember here. I strongly recommend people regarding Lewis and Clark that they read Clay Jenkinson's The Character of Meriwether Lewis. Clay has a very insightful analysis of Lewis's character. In the Cook realm, I think the best way of putting his career in context would be through the works of Glenn Williams, who's a scholar from the United Kingdom. Glenn wrote a book called Voyages of Delusion, which is kind of the long history of the Northwest Passage. What I've tried to do actually with both of these books is kind of give emphasis to the Pacific component of the Northwest Passage, because perhaps not unexpectedly, all of the historiographic interest has been on the Atlantic side of that equation, again, referring to the various iterations the Northwest Passage took. So I'd say if there are two scholars who people want an early introduction to this topic, if it's Meriwether Lewis, I'd say it's the work of Clay Jenkinson. Of course, Stephen Ambrose's book is readily available. On the Cook side, I'd point them to the work of Glenn Williams, and Tony Horwitz wrote a very compelling account about Cook. Although even there's a story to be told relative to a question James asked me, because Horwitz is a great writer. One I could only dream of being as successful as he was. But again, he followed Cook to all of the customary places, what I'll call the warm weather destinations. And at one point, Horwitz says, following Cook to the high latitudes is the literary equivalent of chewing on ice cubes. I maintain that Cook and ice, I mean, that's the issue facing global humanity in the 21st century. And there's no better person to study in the high latitudes than Captain Cook, because he's the one that laid down the ground line, the baseline for the extent of the polar ice packs, which of course are rapidly diminishing. So I've diverted from your basic question, but I hope I covered it in the first half.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you really sort of looking at how today's current environment and how the explorers in light of today's climate change is kind of a fascinating dive. And along those same lines, there's so much talk recently about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm wondering how have views of these expeditions changed over time as society changes, how we view European exploration?
Yeah, well, I think that goes a long way, Linda, towards explaining why explorers are such a fraught subject, for reasons I talked about earlier when I was referring to seeing them as the emblematic invader. I think I'd say this, and to partially answer a question James asked earlier about what might be controversial about the book. I think the Enlightenment period is one of the highlights in the history of Western civilization, and I take some pains in both books to do my best to defend it. For this reason, because unless people think Western civilization made one giant leap from barbarity to modern progressivism, there had to be intermediating steps along the way where humanity's outlook upon itself, inwardly or outwardly, evolved or improved. And and I think particularly in the case of Captain Cook, because he had at root such a favorable view of the indigenous people of Australia, was very critical of how European society was having a negative impact on native societies in Polynesia, but otherwise spoke or created a documentary context, or anyone who read his journal could see that these other cultures obviously had a great deal going for them, that they had their own values, that they didn't need the stamp of approval from Westerners, Europeans, or from Western civilization. In other words, Linda, what I'm trying to say, apropos diversity, equity, and inclusion, the very notions of multiculturalism, pluralism, the autonomous value of indigenous societies, those aren't an invention of modern post-colonial seminar. The roots of those ideas go back to the journals of exploration of a person like Captain Cook and Meriwether Lewis to a lesser extent, because they cracked European civilization's sense of superiority, and they laid the groundwork for the application of the multicultural outlook, which is the avowed sensibility of modern times. And again, that didn't come from nowhere. Somebody had to move those ideas along the line, along the way. And people like Cook in particular played a signal role in that regard. Lewis, to a lesser extent, Cook is a major figure on the road to multiculturalism.
Thank you. What were there any really surprising events that you discovered as you did your research, or anything that you thought was really kind of complete? I mean, I think, the emphasis on the polar exploration of Cook will certainly open the eyes of a lot of people who maybe thought they knew Cook's history. But was there anything else you encountered that you thought was really kind of something you really didn't expect to find?
Well, I think the fact that Cook engaged in ice science experiments certainly qualifies as a surprise. And he did so repeatedly during both the second and third voyage. Sea ice was the last great fascination of Captain Cook's career. And no one would commonly think of that, given the broad pattern of the literature that's described Cook. In Lewis's case, I've studied Lewis longer, so there wasn't as much prospect for the element of surprise as there was Cook, because I had already written a book on Meriwether Lewis. But I think if there's a dawning surprise that's coming upon me, which is that many of the faults that have been attributed to the Lewis and Clark expedition are actually misattributed to Meriwether Lewis. A great deal, a far greater share of them actually need to be laid at the foot of Thomas Jefferson than Meriwether Lewis. Let me just give you one example in that regard. I know we have to wrap up quick. Captain Cook was given very explicit directions on keeping a log, maintaining a journal. Thomas Jefferson just told, of course we know, broadly put, that Meriwether Lewis was a very spotty journal keeper, but it wasn't entirely his fault, because Jefferson's instructions were very vague. They just talked about keeping notes at your leisure opportunities. Yes, Lewis was told to carefully record the latitude and longitude of important places along the way because of its cartographic implications. But at no point in Lewis's instructions does Jefferson say you are to keep a daily journal and bring that back with you when you report to the seat of government. And Jefferson knew about that requirement because he had seen the Admiralty had printed Cook's third voyage instructions. We know Jefferson had that volume because he modeled the rest of Lewis's instructions on the things that Cook had been advised to: botany, mineralogy, native languages, all these, the whole catalog of Enlightenment era science. Those descriptions were taken almost whole cloth from Cook's instructions. But the part where the Admiralty said, keep a daily journal and a log, that's not something Meriwether Lewis did. So I'm having a dawning awareness that, much like Cook has gotten a bad rap in some respects, unjustifiably, whatever faults there are in Meriwether Lewis's journal keeping might not be entirely solely laid at his feet either.
We've got one question from an audience member. Most tribes along the Lewis and Clark Trail are now federally recognized, except the Chinook, without whose assistance the Corps of Discovery could not have wintered over 1805-06. Why is this? Yeah,
Linda, this is the most astonishing circumstance, because the Chinook tribe, one doesn't want to create a hierarchy of importance along these lines, but having said that, few tribes in the history of the Northwest have played as prominent a role, certainly in this phase of history, as the Chinook did. I suppose the reason why they haven't gotten the recognition is that the consequences of the encounter to those people in particular, because they had the earliest and most enduring contact with explorers and fur traders, that created such cultural damage that it disrupted the tribal integrity of itself, and kind of a Chinook diaspora, if you will. And it's just a tremendous puzzle. It ought to be redressed, because they are today, of course, they're still here, they're with us, very much deserving of federal recognition, and it's just an oversight of many generations that status of not being recognized has been allowed to endure.
All right, we have got one other question. Do you think Captain Cook was really fit to take that third voyage, especially being as sick as he was toward the end of his second voyage?
Yes, he was. When he did get sick on the second voyage, but it was well before the end. It was on his second year, not the last, because after he got sick near Easter Island, he spent the ensuing few months in New Zealand, then sailed all the way back across the Pacific and had some of his greatest discoveries actually in the South Atlantic, which is not a part of the world. We think of Cook as a Pacific guy, but actually his most significant geographic discoveries, and certainly the insights he got on sea ice and icebergs, are a Southern Atlantic phenomenon. But to your point and the questioner's point, when Cook returned to England at the end of the second voyage, someone who had been on the first voyage saw him and said to the effect, "He looks as good as he ever has." So the idea that Cook was tired and worn out, there's nothing in the documentary record from that time that suggests that's the case. That idea got planted in the historiography of the subject by J.C. Beaglehole, the editor of the Captain Cook journals, who asked rhetorically, I might add, whether Cook was tired and maybe worn out. And he asked that question because Cook did not deign to explore Fiji and Samoa on the third voyage, when on the second voyage, as Beaglehole said, he would have quickly tied those down. Here's what even the great Beaglehole overlooked. At the end of the second voyage, Cook said, in a language that I dare say every historian of Cook has overlooked, he says, and I quote directly, or roughly paraphrased, quite honestly. I am done with the South Pacific. He'd become bored with the South Pacific Ocean. So on the third, he said that at the end of the second. So on the third, he has an opportunity to survey Samoa and Fiji, but it's not part of his mission. He's the Polynesia, the South Pacific's merely staging grounds for the third voyage, whose emphasis is in the Northern Hemisphere, not the Southern Hemisphere. So Beaglehole plants this idea, and every historian, and I'm speaking categorically, every historian from Australasia, Great Britain, and the few in North America who have written about Cook take a rhetorical question, was Cook tired or worn out, and apply it to the third voyage, where I document in that book, Cook was as bold and vigorous an explorer on the third voyage as he was at any point on the first two. It's just that the South Pacific was not his mission, and he himself said, and published in the Admiralty account, he no longer had anything to do in the South Pacific. So I would say, in just sum, the idea that Cook was sick or worn out at the end of the second voyage is in fact mythology, and one can seek recourse to my book to see if I'm convincing on that score or not.
Thank you. So I know that you've got another book that's currently out for consideration, and I understand the title is something along the lines of Discovering Nothing. You want
Yes.
to talk to us a little bit about that forthcoming project?
Well, I've got a couple that I'm working on. And indeed, UBC Press has my Discovering Nothing. Subtitle is The Pacific Portal to the Northwest Passage After Cook. Basically, it's a continuation of some of the groundwork I've laid in Lewis and Clark Reframed. And I talked a little about it in my dialogue with James McNevin. There was not a single Northwest Passage. There were several of them. Cook went for a certain variety, saltwater to saltwater, Pacific to Atlantic. That didn't exist then, although it's increasingly real now. There's a common misperception that George Vancouver was sent out 15 years after Cook to make up for some presumed shortcomings on the third voyage, because Cook didn't see the Columbia River and didn't see the Strait of Juan de Fuca, notwithstanding that, again, Cook's guidance from the Admiralty said, don't even begin to look for a Northwest Passage until you get to 65 degrees north, because knowledgeable geographers knew there was no mid-latitude way of getting from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Explorers from the Hudson Bay Company, from Mexico to the Arctic, had been from 20 degrees north to 70 degrees north. There was no passage through the continent. But speculative geographers thought that maybe there's an analog to Hudson Bay that one can access off the Pacific Ocean. That's the Northwest Passage that George Vancouver looked for. Well, that doesn't exist either. And there's where Mackenzie comes in. He's going to stitch together the network of rivers and lakes that is the functional equivalent. And that wasn't entirely successful either. And that of course, is the realm Lewis and Clark worked in. They tried to find the American version of what Mackenzie was looking for. And indeed, a Northwest Passage does, in the classic sense, it's coming into reality with the recession of the Arctic ice pack. But a working, practical alternative to the Northwest Passage was in fact created and late in the 19th century with the extension of the Canadian Pacific Railroad and the Northern Pacific Railroad to Tidewater in what I'll call the zone of Cook, Vancouver, Lewis and Clark, and Mackenzie. And so that is the story that I'm hoping to recount in Discovering Nothing. It's not quite it just builds upon the Cook book as well as Lewis and Clark Reframed. And then I've got another project I'm working on, I took a trip to the Arctic with my son a few years ago, which was a very enlivening experience. And the working title for that is The Northwest and Other Passages. That's kind of a personal memoir, but I also want to talk about some famous Arctic explorers like Sir John Franklin, who's the most famous Arctic explorer of all time, or Sir John Richardson, who's virtually unknown, but a great naturalist. The Richardson Mountains, the border between the Yukon and Northwest Territories, are named after him. And he had 3 trips to the Arctic himself. So, but again, going back to what I said to James, I'm studying all of these in juxtaposition with one another, because just in isolation, one explorer's work does not make full sense, because they themselves were operating on the premises and information that they gleaned from other exploratory accounts. So that's in the future, hopefully.
Sounds wonderful. We have another question from the audience. Why did Australia qualify as being the great southern continent that the Admiralty was seeking?
I think the question is, why didn't it? Maybe that, of course, Australia is a continent, qualifies, but the legendary southern continent, the one that Cook is looking for on his second voyage, is presumed to extend from approximately where New Zealand is, all the way over to South America to the east, and maybe even underneath South America, a little bit into the Atlantic. In other words, it was absolutely mammoth on the scale of what Eurasia represents in the Northern Hemisphere. So what classical geography posited was, I mean, just imagine Europe, Russia, and Siberia, but located in the Southern Hemisphere. And a continent, mid to high latitude continent of that dimension simply does not exist. A much smaller one, continent nonetheless, Australia does, but the western coast of Australia had already been discovered or outlined by Dutch explorers. So all Cook did in regard to Australia was survey its east coast. The Dutch navigators had already touched on the western coast. So I hope that answers the question about Australia's place in this story.
Right, and then we did get a correction that it should have said why didn't Australia qualify? Yes, so you interpreted that accurately. Well, I think we're kind of hitting a point to wind down. I want to thank you tremendously, Dave, for your generous time and sharing of all your knowledge. And I want to let everyone know that we've got a second event scheduled for the 17th of February, and that will be starting at 7:00 Pacific time at the same YouTube location. And in that event, we will have Clay Jenkinson talking with Dave Nicandri. So I'm expecting some fireworks, and so I think it's going to be quite a lively conversation, since Clay and Dave know each other well, and I think it will be quite a different event, but certainly another one to look forward to. And I welcome everybody. If you are interested, or you think of questions that after we finish up tonight, feel free to join us 7 p.m. on the 17th of February on the same YouTube channel. So I want to thank everyone listening for attending tonight's event. The information for ordering the books is on the screen, and we encourage you to visit your local bookstores where possible and safe to do so. I really hope that you enjoy this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Good night, and keep reading.